Let's go to the next slide. My name is Christy Witcher. I'm the VP of the Design, Construction, and Environmental Units at HCR, and I'm joined by my colleague Sunitha Sarvaswaran, who is the Director of Sustainability Programs at HCR. We've listed a few other important contacts in this slide, including Samantha Pierce, who's the VP of Sustainability, and Tae Wu, the Upstate Design Unit Director, who will both be managing the chat and Q&A during the webinar today. I also wanted to mention Heather Spitzberg, who's our Director of the Environmental Unit, and Ariel Krasnow, who's the Downstate Design Unit Director, who are two additional important contacts for any content-related questions on the guidelines. Next slide. Just a few housekeeping items to note. All attendees are muted upon entry. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat. If there are any questions that we cannot get to within the next hour, we will be creating an FAQ document answering all the questions submitted during the webinar today, and we will post that on our website for reference. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded and shared within the next week for your reference. Next slide. Okay, a quick peek at the agenda that we've laid out for the webinar today. We'll start with a quick synopsis of the background and intent of the design and sustainability guidelines, followed by an overview of the timeline for applicability of these 2025 versions. We will then go into an overview of the major updates to the sustainability guidelines, followed by an overview of the major updates to the design guidelines, and finish off the session answering questions. Okay, so for those of you who may not know, the design standards at the agency have been around since the 60s, and they've evolved over the years to what are now 3 booklets that we refer to as the guidelines. They consist of the design guidelines, which focuses on criteria and recommendations for functional, durable, cost-effective, affordable housing funded by HCR. They also include the sustainability guidelines, which are broken into 2 booklets, one for new construction and one for rehabilitation of existing buildings. These booklets help projects align with the state goals for carbon reduction and focus on efficient and sustainable design and construction practices. Next slide. Now, many of you may wonder why have design and sustainability standards for affordable housing projects. Why not leave it to the market? For those of you who've worked in market rate housing, you know that this is there are very different forces that drive the success of those projects. It's a very different type of project in operations for affordable housing, and that's why we have criteria that provide a framework which balances cost efficiency with quality and addresses key factors such as longevity of systems, durability, operational efficiency, livability, and accessibility. This slide shows a snapshot of the guiding principles for the criteria in the design and sustainability guidelines, which we put a greater emphasis on in conveying in these updated guidelines. Now I'm going to pass this off to Sunitha to talk about the timeline for applicability of the new guidelines.
Great, thanks, Christy. Just to recap on which multifamily projects financed by the agency are required to follow our design and sustainability booklets. This list should be familiar to folks, but it is required for HDFC 9% LIHTC RFP, 4% LIHTC and standalone tax-exempt bond financing, as well as HCR subsidy financing. Included in this list this year is also HCR SLIC standalone financing, as well as OCR programs, Office of Community Renewal programs, where the term sheet for the program requires design and sustainability guidelines requirements. These 2025 versions are applicable based on the specific programs, what we've summarized below. The 2025 versions will be required for any projects applying to the upcoming 2025 9% RFP round, which will be announced over the summer. It will also be applicable for any HFA projects closing in 2026, and this includes any combination of financing, so that also includes standalones. And as previously mentioned, the 2025 sustainability and design guidelines will be required for any OCR programs that reference those requirements within the term sheet. With that, I will get into the major updates for the sustainability guidelines before passing it back to Chrissy to cover the design guidelines. So just to take a step back, as folks are familiar, the sustainability guideline requirements are separated into 3 sections. Section 1 for both the new construction and existing buildings guidelines cover core sustainability requirements. Section 2 cover building performance requirements at the system level, and then Section 3 includes any additional sustainability requirements. I've summarized on this slide here the major updates for both booklets, but we'll dive into the specific updates within each section for both booklets in the upcoming slides. In sections 1 and 2, we've clarified language based on feedback that we've received from market roundtables, as well as frequently asked questions on our website and stakeholder engagement sessions. One key item to note in sections 1 and 2 is that we do have a new subsection within section 2, which is for refrigerants specifically, and I'll go into more detail about that in future slides. The major updates in section 3 really focus on a few new tools available. So we do now have new HCR resilience checklists that are targeted to New York State specific climate risks. We also have a new solar evaluation tool that is geared towards helping properties understand a very early assessment of solar viability. We also have a new subsection within section 3 focused on embodied carbon, and I'll go into more detail about that in upcoming slides. So to just dive in a little bit on section 1 revisions, we'll go booklet by booklet. First, under the new construction guidelines, we have clarified the commercial thermal isolation requirements under section 1. Previously, these requirements were housed under the building envelope section in section 2, but we have now pulled that up as a core sustainability requirement required regardless of whether a project is pursuing a stretch third-party certification. For both booklets, we have revised the baseline third-party certifications that are available. So we have now included the new LEED version 5 as an option and removed reference to other standards that are less used or less applicable for multifamily properties. Lastly, in the existing buildings guidelines, we have clarified the requirements for properties that have equipment or systems with less than 7 years of remaining useful life or less at the time of application. This is a clarification to previous language where we required any equipment or systems with less than 5 years of useful life at the time of construction completion. This, we hope, gives projects a little bit more clarity as they are developing their scope at the time of application. We've also added in language updating modeling guidance for substantial rehab and moderate rehab level 2 projects that are required to demonstrate a 20% energy efficiency improvement. And lastly, we have moved the historic adaptive reuse waiver option under the building envelope section, as typically properties that have a historic component have a difficult time achieving the envelope requirements for adaptive reuse. Within section 2, the major revisions by each booklet. So under new construction, we have moved up the passive solar design stretch goals to be housed under the envelope section, just for clarity. And we've also expanded the list of acceptable heat pump systems to now include package systems. So project teams will no longer be required to submit a separate waiver if they are pursuing a package system like a vertical, a VRP or a window heat pump. Those will be automatically compliant. In both booklets, we do have a new subsection for refrigerants, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. And we have also clarified what the commissioning requirements are for central and unitized systems. Again, I'll go into more detail. One new update is that we have moved a lot of the HVAC requirements that were previously housed in this under this design guidelines into the sustainability guidelines. So those are not new requirements. Multifamily projects financed by the agency were always required to meet those specific requirements. However, they're now under the sustainability guidelines for clarity and ease of reference. And lastly, we have incorporated a new stretch goal for wastewater heat recovery in both booklets. Under the existing buildings guidelines, we have clarified the HVAC requirements if any HVAC or plumbing equipment is being replaced as part of the scope of work. All projects that are replacing any HVAC or plumbing equipment must follow all of the adaptive reuse requirements under HVAC and plumbing. So to go into a little bit more detail on the section 2 updates, as I mentioned, there is a new subsection for refrigerants. This subsection is really focused on making sure that projects are in compliance with the EPA's phase down for refrigerants. So we are now directly referencing the SNAP list for acceptable refrigerants, and that's linked directly in our guidelines. We're also requiring that projects use refrigerants with a global warming potential of 700 or less. Two additional requirements within the subsection are a new requirement for project teams to maintain a refrigerant inventory for all refrigerant-based systems within the project. And we have also included a requirement for automatic leak detection for very large systems in a central location. Based on stakeholder feedback that we have received, we have clarified the commissioning requirements within both booklets. So we have clarified that all central and unitized HVAC and domestic hot water equipment that are part of the project scope are required to be commissioned, and have clearly detailed what the commissioning requirements are in terms of what is to be submitted to the agency. We are also offering an alternative compliance pathway for any unitized systems, things like mini splits or heat pump water heaters within the units, where third-party certification required functional testing, such as Energy Star functional testing, can be done in lieu of a full commissioning. You will also notice some new terminology within the guidelines to help project teams orient themselves in terms of sustainable materials and new requirements. So global warming potential, ozone depletion potential, those are new definitions within the guidelines as well. And then lastly, in section 3, we have, as I mentioned, several new tools incorporated within this section. So for new construction projects, this includes the HCR resilience checklist, which will be required for all projects. Just want to quickly note that checklists will be completed by HCR Sustainability ahead of application submission. And I'll explain what that means a little bit in the next slide, as well as in upcoming webinars. And then lastly, section 3 major revision for new construction is that we are no longer allowing the use of spray foam within new construction projects. Again, this is only required for new construction. Existing buildings, spray foam is still allowed in certain instances. In both booklets, we have a new solar evaluation tool that is required for all projects. This tool helps projects do an early financial and technical feasibility assessment for solar. At this time, solar implementation still remains a stretch goal for all projects. There is also a new subsection, as I mentioned, for embodied carbon, which includes one baseline requirement as well as stretch goals, which I'll go into in the next slide. And we also have new stretch goals for deconstruction and reuse for new construction and adaptive reuse specifically. Lastly, both booklets also incorporate a new annual refrigerant leak detection requirement. Within the existing buildings guidelines, we also have an HCR resilience checklist. It is encouraged, not required, for project teams to demonstrate that they have completed some level of resilience assessment. We have also clarified the shelter-in-place requirements for adaptive reuse and substantial rehab projects. Properties that have at least 50% senior or supportive housing units must meet the shelter-in-place requirements within the guidelines. So for some highlights into section 3, as I mentioned, there's an embodied carbon subsection to really encourage properties to think about the whole life cycle carbon emissions from their projects. At this time, the only baseline requirement that we have incorporated is requiring that any insulation products that are used within the project are low GWP with low GWP HFC blowing agents. In terms of the stretch goals within this subsection, we are encouraging projects to submit environmental product declarations for high carbon emitting materials. That includes structural materials, insulation, and glazing. We have also incorporated a stretch goal to get properties to think about life cycle assessments if that's something they would like to pursue or they are already pursuing for third-party certification. And then lastly, we did incorporate a deconstruction and reuse stretch goal for any new construction projects that include demolition or adaptive reuse projects to really do an inventory and assess whether any of the materials can be reused for their construction project. In terms of the resilience checklists, as I mentioned, this will be required for all new construction projects. It will not be required for existing buildings, but encouraged in order to meet our current requirements of some level of resilience assessment on the property. In terms of how the resilience checklists work is, again, HCR Sustainability will fill this out on behalf of project teams. There are 3 climate risks that are outlined within the checklist, which is an Excel-based tool: flooding, extreme heat, and strong wind. So the flow is you start with the first climate risk within the checklist, meet all of the baseline requirements for that particular climate risk, check whether the property is at risk for that particular climate risk. If it is exposed, meet any of the exposed requirements, and then consider any of the stretch goals before moving on to the next climate risk, extreme heat, and so on. As I mentioned, we will be having a more in-depth webinar tomorrow to review the HCR resilience checklists, the solar evaluation tool, and our new process for providing the results of these requirements ahead of application, which is called the Sustainability Review Meeting. So please join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. for us to review these new requirements and new tools. With that, I will pass it back to Christy to go over the design guidelines updates.
Great, thank you, Sunitha. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the updates to the 2025 HCR design guidelines were pretty significant. We used the past year to take a deep dive into all of the content through internal review committees, soliciting feedback from the development community, and attaining real feedback from management teams for projects currently in operations. The objective is to continue this process over the coming years to ensure the goals and criteria in the guidelines are relevant and practical. And as such, we reassessed all of their requirements for cost, impact, and practicality. A few of the higher level changes that we made to the booklet include reorganizing the content for easier navigation to criteria, adding separate sections for environmental criteria and moderate rehabs, and separating out supportive and senior housing requirements that would overlay on a project as it's applicable. Additionally, we attempted to clear up what we deemed as required criteria versus what we encourage projects to do as improved design measures. This is conveyed through the graphics and text. So as you can see here in the slide, the content with the arrows and the lines would be considered required criteria, and everything you see with the little orange colored plus signs are highly encouraged. We also identified where exceptions are permitted through the guidelines with these little kind of exclamation point icons you can see on the lower left side there. And finally, we made attempts to align with HPD criteria and clarify where specific exceptions are permitted in HPD funded projects. Next slide. One of the major updates that happened in the environmental section of the design guidelines, aside from outlining in greater detail many of the existing requirements, was on radon mitigation. Now, currently, depending on the type of funding in a project, it may be subject to 2 different standards, which weren't able to be determined until we get into the environmental review for a project. So the major issue was that one regulation referenced the CDC maps, which are really difficult to navigate and updated on a more regular cadence. And the other reference standard is the EPA radon maps. So in attempts to make it easier for projects to determine whether radon mitigation would be applicable in the early design phases of a project, we created a chart that combines the 2 requirements for easier reference. This will be posted on the HCR website and linked in the design guidelines as well. So the requirements are listed by county and indicated with either a Y or an N for whether they're applicable. In those counties in which the standards have changed due to the CDC data, we've marked those with an asterisk for your reference. Okay, next slide. Moving on to play areas in family projects. We've revised the language in the guidelines to stress that we are requiring play areas and not playgrounds in certain family projects. We realize that it's not appropriate for all family projects to have large playground equipment with the safety service. So we are encouraging projects to design creative play spaces that would meet the need of the anticipated population on site. For smaller sites with limited outdoor space, integrated passive play equipment like playhouses, sensory panels, or activity walls, and chess or game tables for teens may be more appropriate. For larger housing authority type sites that cater to many children and have large open spaces, a larger playground would likely be the more appropriate proposal. We are giving the power to the designers and owners to propose what is appropriate for a project. But in doing this, we hope that you realize the importance of these spaces and put thought into your proposals. We give more freedom, as we give more freedom of choice on these projects, we're hoping that the development community works with that freedom and focuses on things that are important to the affordable housing community without our unit having to take a heavier hand on these requirements again. Okay, next slide. Moving on to residential common space allowances. And this is really a measure of the building's efficiency. And the intent is to ensure that we're designing buildings that maximize usable space. We took the current criteria and created a chart to make this requirement much simpler to understand. You can see that we broke this down by construction type and have the base requirements listed at the top. Below this are allowable increases to the residential common space when there are spaces for things like supportive services in supportive housing projects, or fitness rooms and computer labs that can function as co-working spaces or homework rooms, something like that. We also added an allowable increase of 5% for projects that are located in New York City. Now, this was based on a study of a number of waivers that were granted for acceptable increases in residential common space in many New York City projects. We found that the tighter sites common in New York City projects tend to result in a larger percentage of common space, even though those layouts were really quite efficient. So we felt that this was a reasonable blanket increase for those projects. Next slide. A few other notable changes to the common space criteria. We included considerations for the location and security of package areas and the design of trash and recycling rooms based on feedback that we received from numerous projects and operations. We also called attention to fire safety considerations for e-bike storage, given the issues that many projects have been experiencing with fires. One larger change in this section is that we are now asking projects to include storage and workspaces for maintenance personnel on projects. We aren't defining a required size for the space, since the need will really vary on each project, but we want to ensure that the designs take into account the need for this space. This was one of the issues that were expressed on many of the projects that we visited, and we found that projects were often using other spaces for storage and workshop for maintenance personnel, such as the building mechanical and equipment rooms, oftentimes obstructing the required clearances at either panels or equipment, or using spaces meant for other uses like bicycle storage. Next slide. So in the dwelling units section, we created cut sheets for each of the dwelling unit types, so that rather than funneling through 6+ pages of dwelling unit criteria to pull out what's applicable to the dwelling units on your project, we have a single sheet that outlines the major design parameters for each bedroom type or unit type. We also stress the need to have living and dining spaces that are appropriately sized to accommodate the number of potential occupants in a unit. As I noted earlier in the presentation, we've updated some criteria to better align with HPD design standards. So in studios, we now allow 24-inch ranges, 11 cubic foot refrigerators, and 24-inch bath vanities. And I'll discuss some of the changes to the allowable unit sizes in the next slide. Another larger revision this year is that we're asking all bulk storage to be located in the dwelling units rather than remotely in the building. The reason for this is really to increase efficiencies, since remote bulk storage tends to be an inefficient use of space. And we know bulk storage, when it's considered in the preliminary design stages, can be incorporated into the unit design. There are a few exceptions for this in projects that have unusable existing space that would serve as remote bulks, that could serve well as remote bulk storage, such as existing basements, maybe in an adaptive use project, or other unusable spaces such as those built into a slope of a hill. With this, we also reassessed the required size of bulk storage and reduced it to 10 square feet for 1-bedroom units and 20 square feet in 3-bedroom units. We also opened up some of the allowable spaces in dwelling units. So now we'll allow for a half bath in a 2-bedroom unit and 2 baths in a 3-bedroom unit. And we're also allowing in-unit laundry when certain requirements are met to lessen the risk associated with in-unit laundry. So we know this preference for in-unit laundry really varies on kind of two completely opposing sides of the spectrum. But if your team is really equipped to manage this from an operational side, we're no longer going to restrict it or require a waiver to include it in the units. Next slide. Okay, moving on to dwelling unit size. We've made updates to align with the minimum allowable size for HPD dwelling units for projects that are located in New York City. And we've increased the maximum size allowable on all unit types to accommodate the anticipated updates to accessibility standards and larger required clearances for the New York State Building Code, in-unit bulk storage requirements that I just mentioned, in-unit laundry allowances, and the additional bath/half bath allowances that I also just noted. We also listened to concerns that have been expressed about the maximum allowable size for 3-bedroom to 5-bedroom dwelling unit types and the difficulty in making those designs work. So we incrementally increase the size of those units to make it easier to meet those space design parameters. We also fixed the strange gap that previously existed in the dwelling unit size allowances so that there are no longer gaps. So for instance, I don't know how many of you noticed this in the past, but if you have a unit that's say 730 square feet, it was previously too large to be considered a 1-bedroom, but too small to be considered a 2-bedroom, which admittedly was an issue in our standards. And we've fixed that so there are no longer these gaps. Next slide. Okay, accessibility in the dwelling units has been updated in the guidelines, and we've clearly defined that it's applicable to all funding programs as a base requirement. Because there's a lot to unpack with this, we're hosting an additional webinar that focuses solely on the updates to the HCR accessibility requirements, and we'll also review the anticipated changes to the New York State Building Code related to accessibility, provide a general overview of multiple accessibility regulations and how to apply those requirements in specific spaces. The big picture is that we are utilizing reference standards from the code specific to either New York State or New York City and layering in a few additional requirements to meet the other applicable regulations such as Section 504. There are a few other requirements in these accessible units that outline or define how to meet storage requirements that are HCR requirements in bathrooms. And we are also encouraging skirted lavatories rather than pipe protection at the lavatories. And the goal with this is really to mitigate this institutional appearance in homes and provide adequate storage and workspace in bathrooms. You know, thinking functionally about what all of us need in a bathroom, especially one that you might share. And I think we can all agree that it's very difficult to use functionally when you don't have any usable counter space. And what we really want to mitigate is tenants adding storage shelving themselves, which tends to get moldy or rusty in these bathrooms. And sometimes we often see this in our existing projects with this setup. And again, you know, webinar number 3, we'll really dive in on accessibility. It's going to be a long webinar. We are working on the continuing education credits, so please sign up for that if you're really interested in the updates to accessibility. Next slide. A few other notable dwelling unit updates based on the feedback that we received from projects in operations. The smoke soffit that was previously required at kitchens is now optional. We've had some projects find that they're really ineffective while others claim that they're very useful. So all architects should really coordinate the need for the kitchen soffits with the building management team. Also, the requirement for natural lighting and ventilation remains largely the same, though because we have seen more waivers for borrowed light in dwelling units, we've added some specific parameters that you have to meet in order to waive the natural light requirements and utilize borrowed light. Now note that we are not accepting artificial light as an exception for this. It must be borrowed light. So as you can see in this diagram on the left, the bedroom has a transom window with direct view to the exterior window. So if you're standing in that bedroom, you would be able to have access to natural light by looking out the transom window. In the example on the left, we have a bedroom that's tucked to the back of the unit with glazing in the door. And as you look out the door, you're looking into a dark hallway. This is not a situation that we would consider acceptable for borrowed light because the first available light is down the hall and around the corner. So this is something we want projects to keep in mind early in the design phase. This is really what we're looking for when you're looking for a waiver for borrowed light in the projects. Okay. Next slide. We're almost there, I promise. I wanted to touch on a few notable updates for material specifications. We added clarifications for preferred exterior materials based on durability, but we do understand the need to balance costs on proposed materials. So please do understand that. For EIFS, we have specified that we are only accepting rain screen or other pressure equalizing installations to mitigate moisture issues. For vinyl and aluminum windows, we've lowered the threshold for buildings that are 3 stories and less to allow for LCPG 40 rather than LCPG 50 windows, which we believe will open up the available types of windows that can be used on projects. And lastly, we've added requirements that attempt to mitigate the need for safety glazing. So while floor to ceiling windows are beautiful, they're also costly. And we need to make best efforts to design buildings that can be built economically while still providing the livable and functional spaces that the tenant needs. And we really want designers and development teams to consider what's best for the residents in these buildings and prioritize those things in the budget. Next slide. This last slide touches on some system requirement updates that we've made to the guidelines. Because we're now allowing in-unit laundry equipment in the dwelling units without a waiver, we've added requirements for drain pans that need to be tied to a floor drain or with leak notification systems when these appliances are provided in the dwelling units. We are requiring floor drains and mechanical ventilation in tract rooms. We've specified that electrical panels and manifold access panels cannot be located in bulk storage closets because we need to ensure that the clearance to access those panels is there when the room is full of storage. We've revised the lighting requirements in living and dining areas to minimize what turns out as more of an awkward lighting arrangement that often happens based on the previous requirement that we had. And we are encouraging ceiling fans, especially in areas that are subject to heat vulnerability as found in the Sustainability Resiliency Assessment. We are allowing CPVC to be used in common area water lines that service the building and dwelling units, but not within the dwelling units themselves. We've simplified the PEX requirements and recommendations, so hopefully those are more clear. We've simplified and clarified language on high-speed internet infrastructure and added allowances for non-hardwired personal device-based intercoms. We've added recommendations for master antenna systems that would allow tenants to access free local HD channels. And lastly, we're recommending that projects are considering security systems, we're recommending that projects consider the installation of security systems in projects early in the design phase of a project so that it is part of the base cost for the project. We don't want these to be an afterthought during construction or when the project is in operations if it is something that's anticipated as a need on the project.